Mod me, mod me.
Oh, yeah. How do I do that? Mod. Oh, hey. Okay. You've been modded. Is
Sweet.
Albert? Albert is not,
Um,
Alright. Doesn't matter.
okay.
Because you'd have to have a Twitch account first, but yeah, we're now live. And let me just, get
Woo! Hey,
everyone
everybody.
to,
Everyone.
let me,
Mod me, mod me.
I'm taking away your mod status after the stream.
No.
Hey, Ed Riofer, Zeus Monolith, Date Nagasi. Yeah, that was Steve asking to be modded. All right, well, let's go ahead. And Garlando Bloom is here.
Hey,
So
Garlando, what's up, man?
we have with us. So unfortunately, Steve and Albert are sharing a one screen, but we have Albert here, and
Hey, everyone.
Albert's working on Museum of Simulation and Technology, and then Steve Swink working on Scale. And
Hey.
I thought today we would just kind of hang out and talk about level design with impossible geometry.
In other words, why we're total idiots for considering making games like this.
Yeah.
The bravest
Oh.
kind of fools.
So how do we should we maybe start off and we'll rotate between everyone and then talk about our games.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I won't. So maybe. Yeah, Steve, do you wanna get started? And I'll put if you screen share, I think we should have
Right.
that here in the center.
There's so many windows going on. Let's make sure that I can do this without breaking it. And I want to share that screen. Okay, hang on. I think that worked.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
Okay. So what am I doing? Just talking about what my game is a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. Give everyone an introduction to what Scale is.
Sure. I mean, it's basically a game from the first-person perspective, like all three of our games, and excuse me, you can scale objects up and down as much as you want with some constraints, and those constraints have evolved over time to try and actually make something interesting. So I can just run the game real quick. I don't know how good the frame rate's going to be, but we'll give it a whirl. Yeah, the stream will probably be laggy. We'll see. We have experience. My wife runs a charity stream that benefits the Sierra Club called Beat the Dev, and it's like bringing together multiple people to show multiple games, have them compete and stuff like that. It's always tough. Okay, so can you guys actually see that?
I can see it. Yeah, I mean they're sort of lagging due to OBS, and then lag due to I might.
You're like trying to broadcast Google Hangouts rebroadcast through OBS, which is going to be
Yeah.
pretty gnarly. But anyway, yeah. So you can scale objects up and down as much as you want. Just cool. You can pick them up and move them and do stuff. Pretty straightforward stuff. That's just like the basic concept. And then what I was going to talk about with you guys today is I've been working on a series of levels based on the idea of being able to scale the whole world up and down, which causes a bunch of problems, but also has a lot of like neat and interesting things about it. So I was going to show you some of the stuff that I was doing and just kind of like get feedback or whatever. So here's a level that I just was working on yesterday. So you pull this lever, and none of this is like final graphics, obviously. But so it starts a timer, and there's no way for me to get across this bridge and reach this thing before it shuts all the way down. Right, so that door is going to close before I can get there.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. So then obviously the giant glowing gem thing over here.
Steve, can I ask you when you look at things just to hold it for a little longer?
Oh, because of the frame rate?
Because of the frame rate, yeah.
Sure.
Um,
So, I mean, I can scale the whole world down. Now I can scale it back up again.
Wait, what are you scaling now? You're scaling the diamond?
So the diamond is like an anchor point where you can scale the entire world up and down.
Yeah.
So like the whole world is changing as I'm doing this.
Oh, I see. I see.
Now this whole terrain is like tiny underneath me, and so the idea is that I can hit that switch, and that allows me to move really quickly through this world. So instead of having to walk that long path, I can just take like one step, and then I'm there, and then I just have to scale the world back up again,
Oh.
and then I'm like already here by this thing.
Oh, and then it's introduced that you can use the diamond as the pivot point.
Yeah, yeah. This would be like level 3 or something after
Oh, I
this has
see.
been introduced. Yeah, anyway, so hard to like show an entire game, but in like 1 minute. But basically, you can scale stuff up and down as much as you want, and that has a lot of ramifications. And I'm exploring lots of different crazy stuff with that. And that's pretty much all I'm working on right now.
And the anchor point is because otherwise, if you try to scale the separate parts, you'd be scaling like the one island and then the tree and that the diamond lets you do the whole thing at once.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Should we move on to Albert to give an
Yeah.
intro?
Sure.
Yeah. All right, Albert.
Oh yeah, should I do a screen share?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I can
Um,
stop
that-
sharing,
how do I?
and then I should pop back up again once I do that. I think.
It's like in the upper right corner.
There we go.
Oh, I see. Screen share.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's try this and see if it works.
Oh yeah, this is perfect.
It's working?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Oh, so I guess we're all three of us are using Unity. So,
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
Another
that's-
common element.
So my game is called Museum of Simulation Technology. Oh, and that's just a temporary name right now. It's based off of the idea of forced perspective. So what that is basically when you look at something from one angle, and the ambiguity of depth lets you kind of, resize things really fast. So there's like this optical illusion that goes on. It's, for example, when you're taking a photo of the Tower of Pisa, and you might tell your friend to, go in front and hold it up, and that uses the same concept as well. And so what's happening in this game is that objects are projected as far as they can go, and then they change their size and distance accordingly, so they seem the same to you, and in screen space. Yeah, and then there's like a bunch of puzzles that tell me if I'm if it's going too fast for the.
it seems fine. Yeah.
It's fine. Okay.
I mean, I think it's just gonna like at a low frame rate, it's gonna be hard to tell what's going on in any of these games.
Yeah, but
Okay.
it's sort of enough. We get the rough concepts. Yeah.
Yeah. So this game plays a lot with optical illusions, and also the idea of I forget what I was gonna say. But yeah, that's basically it.
First perspective. Is that the word you were looking for?
Right.
So yeah, I guess I will talk about my game now.
Oops.
Oops. Let me move this down here. So I'm working on this game. Let's see if it runs.
Go Manifold Garden, go.
Yep. Oh, Yeah, let me screen share with you guys so you guys can see what I'm talking about.
I can. Well, we can watch on the
Oh yeah,
stream.
you can watch on the stream too. Never mind.
I'm gonna move
So
my
let me
camera so it's
deploy
not in such a weird place.
Yeah, some people have some questions about Albert's game. That the video came out like 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, how we've all been working on our games for several years at this point.
Nonsense. They were all started yesterday.
It was actually we had an Impossible Space game jam yesterday,
Oh, nice.
and
Oh,
no,
nice, yeah.
I mean this is I was just
Oh,
kidding.
right.
Oh, right. That's how we created everything.
It's part of the joke, right?
Okay. Come on, run. Okay, so the core mechanic in Manifold Garden is that you have the ability to... Oh, I need to disable the audio. Is that you have the ability to change gravity and walk onto different surfaces. So, and then there are... The puzzle elements are based on different colored objects. So when you can only press a blue button when you're in blue gravity, and you can only interact with, a yellow gravity box. Later on, it's introduced there are double gravity trees. So these boxes, they fall in the direction of yellow gravity, and then also fall in the direction of green, and eventually. Yeah, sorry about the audio. So eventually when you make it outside, another major mechanic... So the game started off as mainly about the gravity switching, and now a big part of it is that the world wraps around in 3D. So when I fall off, I don't fade to black, there's no death, there's simply another version of the world beneath, and that kind of leads to all kinds of different ramifications. So that's what Manifold Garden is, in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it, but so
That's pretty cool.
yeah, I guess we're all kind of looking at different aspects of just weirdness that you can't do in normal life. I think that's the one common thread, is that these are all things you can't do normally in real life, and we're trying to explore them in a game.
But I think there's also a certain philosophy that all of us are kind of starting from that led us to the idea to begin with, and it's also embodying, at least partially, the way that we're approaching the design. Like, I know you have different influences in the way that you're doing your meta structure than I do, and so on. But I think everybody started from the same point of kind of, oh, here's like a weird, interesting thing. Let's figure out all the cool things we can do with it. And then once we have a bunch of neat, interesting, output from that, let's figure out a way to curate it and present it to the players so that it's something really cool that lots of people would want to be able to play. And then we start thinking about like meta design and flow and how to introduce puzzles and the kinds of things that you often think about when you're doing puzzle game design and so on.
Maybe that would be a good place to start, at least for our discussion, just kind of like maybe initially where we got the idea from and how we're approaching it, like setting the space for that. Yeah, I don't know, Steve. Do you wanna start with scale, kind of?
Like how did I get started on the idea? Or
How did you get started, and then also like what's your approach in doing it? Kind of like I know you've talked about Mario 64 as a big influence, for example.
Right.
That kind of like the core idea, not in some ways, which is not necessarily scaling objects, right? It's like the idea that play is really more sort of the central idea, and then scale is a method to explore that idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to try and think back about what, like, I think at the beginning it was just like, I was just thinking about different, like, simple concepts that can be exploited for gameplay in interesting ways. Exploited is a bad word, but you know what I mean. Like Braid is about time. It's like a different way of thinking about time in games. Rewind time as much as you want. That's cool. Did I just like freeze? There we go.
Oh no,
Oh,
no,
that
you're
was
good.
awesome.
No.
On my version of the stream, I just like froze and then caught up in a really awesome way. Like I was in speed mode. So yeah, so in like Braid, it's like time, right? And then Portals has this unique idea of, you know, like, well, what if I can put a portal on a wall that I can then pass through? And let's explore those ramifications deeply. Let's not just use time rewinding as a way to not have like lives or death or whatever. It's like, let's go deep on what it actually means. Like, if I can rewind time as much as I want, what does death even mean in the game? Well, there is no death in the game, but there are like, you know, states that I want to get into that I can't get into and so on. So I was just thinking about that, and I was just thinking about like movement, rotation, time, and then I just thought of scale because I do a lot of 3D modeling, or I did back
Yeah.
ages and ages ago. And so I was just like, oh, well, what would be the best way to do scaling in a game? And I thought of a couple of different ideas, and I just figured being in first person, pointing at something, and then just saying that right there, I want to make that bigger or smaller. That was kind of like the core of the idea. And then as I was playing around with that, one of the things that occurred to me was this idea that, oh shit, the fuzz.
Is that, I couldn't tell who is it coming from.
It might be Albert. But anyway, yeah, so then I had this idea that like everyday objects have a certain size, and we all have an index in our brains about what the size of everyday objects are. And when we see something that's particularly large or particularly small, it's just inherently fascinating to people. So like little tiny miniaturized fruit is like a whole genre of like tumblers and you know, like big insanely large things. Like you can take a chair and like in on the shores of a lake in Wisconsin or whatever, there's like this artist that did all these like installation pieces of insanely large chairs and then like insanely large, insanely small chairs. And it's just weird and interesting because it calls into clarity for you the fact that all these things have this like finite size that we all kind of agree on. Like a chair is always between this size and that size, and an apple and all these kinds of things. And so if you can just scale things up and down as much as you want, you can create these interesting situations where you have like a building, the Empire State Building, that you shrink down and then you can just pick it up and carry it, and then you can like put it on a shelf, and then you can take a trophy off that shelf and scale it up until it's, you know, the size of the Empire State Building or whatever it is, right? And that just is inherently playful and interesting, and it just felt like the direction to go was not like this sort of serious, somber thing, but I also didn't want to just make it purely about absurdity because it's about everyday objects, and so then I kind of ended up in this place that I am now. And actually, the structure of the game, the intention was to make it like Mario 64, and I actually had this thing where there was like, you know, like I don't know if you remember the earlier version, there was like a level select screen every time you enter a level, and the idea was to put 8 stars or particles, as I call them, as part of the fiction. The main character is a particle physicist who invents this device. There'd be 8 of these particles hidden in one world, and then you would go do this world, and like the world would have a structure very similar to Mario 64, where like you could do one goal, and then you could like select a different goal, and that would change some of the starting conditions of the level and stuff like that. And just over time, it sort of evolved out of being exactly like that to being more like what it is now, which is kind of it's more like a free-form puzzle game with like sublinear tracks, I guess. I don't know a good way to put it. Basically, like, you can go into a level and there can be 2 to 3 goals in that level maybe, and there's probably some secret stuff. When you complete that level, you go through a door, and that door leads to another level, and these levels are grouped in groups of 3. And so to unlock the 3rd level in a series, you have to go through the door to 2 and 3 like that. But then once they're unlocked, they're all available in the hub level. And that is a complicated description, but I can show you if I share my screen. That would probably be sensible, wouldn't it?
Sure, yeah. Hello, Mike Two String. By the way, Mike Two String says scale game reminds him of Katamari Damacy.
I'll take that.
Yeah, I can sort of see that game also has a. That sort of also plays with the idea of scale, sort of.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. When you talked about each level having 2 to 3 goals, is that you have to finish all 3 of them in order to progress?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's meant to be. There's gating, right? I think the structure is more like Metroid Prime or something now.
I see. Hey,
Where you meant
Garrett
to.
Hulk. Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Yeah, I just switched it over, but I was just going to show that like sort of you come in here. This would be like the hub level, the starting area, and there are these like locked areas that have multiple doors, and they'll show you how many particles are left to collect in each one. This is all temporary artwork, obviously, but I was just trying to do like the dumbest possible iconic thing, and then come back and do a fancy up pass later. This is all you can see the Pro Builder texture.
I see.
Oh yeah. And then and I've been working on things like trying to provide a visual theming for these sort of like terrarium things, so that when you see this like desert terrarium, you'll know instantly that leads to the desert area. And
Oh.
my goal is for you to be able to play the game and then like put it down and come back 3 months later, and you can look around this environment and know exactly where you are. Like you could walk over here and be like, oh, okay, well, I have 3 particles left here, and this door's not unlocked yet. So if I go here and I can find that door, I can unlock that one, and so on. And then I have these sort of like larger unlock sections, which lead to different sections of the game. And there's like, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Levels and levels and levels and levels.
And they're all unlocked with the number of particles, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a holdover from the Mario 64 stars kind of thing, but it works well enough for right now. I think there's probably like a better, more elegant way to do it, but at this point I'm kind of just like, works well enough.
Yeah.
More important to focus on the content.
What is to prevent the player from going over the castle, right? Because like I think one problem that I have is gating, because you can change gravity in the wall wrapping. That like these walls and doors in a normal game that would be a barrier, right? But I imagine for you, can't you? Like, what about shrinking the castle and just stepping over that door?
So right now the gating is that there's no world gem that lets you scale this world available.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay, right. You can't
Right.
scale.
Yeah, and there's a certain. I mean, this is the types of issues that start to arise. And I know we've talked about issues like that you guys have had in your games as well. That you start to run into these weird, obscure issues about like self-consistency in the world. So what in the world of scale indicates to you what's the fiction behind and the visual representation of when things are scalable and when they're not scalable, right? And it's a problem that has been present in the design of the game for a really long time, and I still don't feel like I have a great answer for it. But that's part of the reason why I put in like the gem thing as like the focus for the levels where you can scale the whole world up and down, because it provides at least a conceptual hook to say, well, if I looked around this environment and found something, I found a secret, and I was able to like access it by doing some little puzzle or something, and inside that there was a world scaler gem, then I could just scale the whole world down and just hop over this wall, and that would take me to the next section. And in fact, that might be like an interesting puzzle to do anyway. Like you do one of these doors, and then you do another one, and then you get to a third one, and there's no door in it at all. It's just a giant castle wall that you can't get through, and you have to sort of find the world gem to progress to the next area. But that's the kinds of things that start falling out of this design. It's like, okay, so how do I obscure elements and make actual puzzles out of this kind of stuff? But yeah, anyway, so that's the game. That's kind of where it is right now from a meta design standpoint. One thing I was talking to Albert about this, because we've been doing these kind of like weekly meetings. We call it the Impossible Club. It's really it's been really productive and really fun.
I'm there in spirit.
Yeah, you're what? I mean, we should conference you in if you're not too tired. Cause it's usually like pretty late night for you because you're on the East Coast.
Yeah, in Chicago. I'm in Midwest. Yeah.
Oh, you're Midwest. Yeah, for some reason I thought you were in New York.
Yeah,
you're in
it's
Chicago.
not. So it's an hour. Not as bad, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but we were talking to Albert about this. We were talking about like the difference between for lack of a better term, like meaty puzzles, which is it's like something that you have to kind of like you have to sort of sink your teeth into it and think about it. Like it causes that kind of like,
Oh,
and a good puzzle has that aspect of like you see all the puzzle elements, they're immediately presented to you visually, and then you go to try and do the obvious thing, and the obvious thing is not the solution, and a consequence of the obvious thing not being the solution is that now you have to engage in some deep thought, and then you have this like lateral leap of insight based on, in theory, the experimental mechanic, and it's sensible in the world and self-consistent with the way that you've constructed the world, and then you get this like wonderful hit when you figure it out, and it gives you deeper insight into the way that this sort of experimental mechanic functions.
right.
And so like that would be an example of like a really good meaty puzzle that both has like novelty, works well with the experimental mechanic, and is challenging. But we were sort of talking about how in these kinds of mechanics, like in his game especially, and in my game to a certain degree, there's kind of a difference between like meaty puzzles that take a certain amount of time to execute and are challenging and have a certain number of steps. I want to call them procedural, but that term is way too loaded. But they require a procedure. You have to do A, then B, then C in order to solve them.
Yeah.
There's a difference between those types of puzzles and puzzles which are almost entirely novelty based. So like
Could you
this
explain what's a novelty versus? I understand the, for lack of a better word, procedural, but not so much the novelty one.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, Albert can talk because he sort of has the market cornered on really cool like novelty based puzzles. But
Right.
for example, in my game, I have a goal that's not currently hooked up to the progression, but it was in like trailers and stuff where you can like scale the moon, and that will affect the tides,
Oh,
and
I see.
it will cause like the ocean to drain away, and on the floor of the
Right.
ocean, there's like a treasure chest or whatever. That's like very novelty based, and it's there's a lot of really really cool stuff like that in Museum of Simulation Technology, and there is like a fair amount of cool stuff like that in scale. Like there's like a little tiny house, and you can like scale up that house and get inside, and there's like another house in there, and you take that house out of the first house, and you put that, whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
I call them more one-off puzzles. Just in the
One-off
sense
is
that
another way to put it. Yeah.
you don't build a system around them, and you sort of have to like they have one idea on their own, but it's not like this. It's not sort of repeated elsewhere.
So, so the struggle that we were, yeah, exactly. And so the struggle that we've been discussing a lot lately is like, the degree to which you should put in puzzles that are one-offs versus puzzles that are have like multiple systems and depth that then give you additional insight into more areas of the game. Because like for this puzzle, right, the idea was that you have to scale up this block to hit this trigger plate on the underside here, but you can't both scale up this block and hit the trigger plate if you want to hop off it, like if you want to use it the way that you've been taught to use blocks like this earlier in the game. And so the solution is that you have to put it under here and then ride it out, because objects retain their shape even as they grow. So because the shape is long and thin, as it pushes me out of here, it will activate that thing, as well as let me get out here.
Can you crush yourself?
You can't. You used to be able to, and I thought it was really funny, but people were just doing it way too often, and it was really like disruptive to the flow.
Oh, so you can't now. Like, what
You
happens
can.
if you...
So now all that happens is it just stops scaling.
Oh, I see. Right.
Like when something gets too big, if it would cause like a penetration between two objects,
Right.
then it stops scaling. And the same thing happens if you're like inside a house and you try to scale it down.
Oh,
Right.
I
So
see.
it just kind of stops you and gives you like a little bonk. The bonk is like pretty punitive. People don't like it anyway, so it's
Right.
becomes avoidable. So then, because shape is conserved, you can like rotate an object that's small and thin like this, and then you can hop on top of it, and you can use that to ride up to a new area. Like, for example, if you were just carrying this thing and you tried to just use this to get up out of this pit, you can't do it because of the shape of the object.
Right.
It'll hit the walls, and so you have to like do this. But I would classify this puzzle as like interesting to play, because now I'm like up here and like I did something kind of unique with this object, and it's kind of cool. But it's definitely not like a showpiece puzzle. It's not gonna go in the trailer, right? It doesn't have a lot of novelty. It's not like a really cool one-off.
But it does give a good understanding of what the mechanic is and what you can do. maybe.
So that's why I call it like a meaty puzzle, right? And so
Yeah.
so Albert and I think we were both lamenting that we don't have enough meaty puzzles, or we felt like we don't have enough meaty puzzles, and so we put a lot of energy into developing some more like meaty kinds of puzzles,
I see. Interesting.
as opposed to like novelty based stuff. And it's just like this interesting balance that we've been talking about. So I thought maybe we could talk about that for a little while.
Yeah. I know there was one thing I wanted to say earlier, and I would say that before I forget, is when you were talking about sort of good puzzle design, I feel it's always great when at first it seems impossible. Like, and
Yeah.
then, people are like, what the fuck? And then after a while, it sort of, once you kind of have that insight, it all makes sense. I think that is always sort of something to strive for. At least for me. But perhaps, since we were talking about maybe now would be a good time to have Albert talk about his game, and I think some of these ideas with meaty puzzle novelty. Yeah.
Definitely.
All right, Albert. Switching to you.
All right, yeah, I guess I have to talk now. Yeah, so well, okay, so the I'll start with like how the game started, and then kind of some of my inspirations, and kind of play them off with Steve's, because I think it's really interesting on what different things we relate to, right? So my game started off as kind of just like a 1 week, homework assignment that I had to do. So I'm like, okay, I'll do something physics-based. I'll do something first person with, cubes that I don't have to model anything. And then, like Steve, I was thinking of, well, what different way can I manipulate an object in space that's fun and interesting, right? And then I thought of a bunch of different ways. What if I had a space in front of me where I could, control the rotation, or like have some kind of force field? And I was like, well, that's all too complicated. Let me find the simplest way I can do it. So I thought, well, what if I just, put something down, or like just grab something up? And then after a while, I like made the connection of, well, what if I just grabbed it like I was, using my fingers? And so I didn't actually know it was called forced perspective, or, I wasn't inspired by, a really cool story like, oh, I went to Japan and I met, an old woman in a fisherman's market or something. It's just, I feel some of these games, they come out of you're just thinking of mechanical things. It's more like, it starts out more logical, and then over time you start to kind of build more of the surrounding world and surrounding narrative. And that's a lot of what I'm dealing with right now. So I feel that my kind of perspective on puzzle games is different from Steve's, right? So like the two games that inspire me the most are Antechamber and Portal. And they're two different very games, two very different games. And so first of all, Portal was really cool to me, but there were a lot of puzzles that I feel kind of were more about the order of operations on how you solve them, and less about kind of like that single, epiphany moment when you were learning how to solve them. It's like you knew from the beginning that I will eventually solve this puzzle, and it's through an order of steps, but I just need to kind of figure them out. And that contrasts with Antechamber, which, at least for the first 2 hours or so, there's a lot of really, I want to say, kind of like one-off puzzles, right? But they're all just about really one thing, and not really about messing with these a lot of elements, which can be fun, but after a while it can be a bit tedious. And I feel like a lot of puzzle games will sometimes, when you play them, you'll kind of understand why they're interesting from an intellectual level, but they're not kind of, you don't feel super awesome when you're playing them. I don't know if that's the right word. But so I'm trying to build a game where, when you go from moment to moment, there can be something really cool. So in terms of that, it ends up being more weird moments and less kind of meaty puzzle moments.
Right.
So that's also like what I'm trying to counterbalance with, right?
Yeah. So I think like it's interesting because when I played your game, a lot of people compare my game to Antichamber, and I think
Right,
largely because of the art style. But I feel like yours actually has a much more similar vibe playing it. And I think this goes back to what Steve was saying, and what you're saying is that they're much more. And I think Antichamber is really there's some systematic stuff later, but it's much more about these. Yeah, I say one off, but that's not like derogatory, right? It just means that they're
Right.
Right.
more about like it's built for this thing, and it has and you do stuff. I don't know if you still have it, but where you turn around and the world is different. The hallway behind you is gone, right? Which kind of
Yeah.
serve as like, okay, what you learned before, forget it. Like
Right.
that we closed the door there.
Well, it's almost like it's like how you're priming the player to think about your world, right? It's like in my world, I'm very much striving for a certain amount of consistency. I mean, it's like absurd consistency, but I want it. I don't want you to be able to turn around and something's changed behind you or whatever. But in Albert's game, he's done a really good job of establishing that this is like a crazy dream world,
Yeah.
and the rules of it are self-consistent, but like anything can happen, and it gives him a lot of lateral mobility to do like really crazy things that maybe wouldn't fit in a game where you were trying to have a really clean like this is the expression of this mechanic and this and this and this way. Like the thing with the window, right? Like I always thought that was really cool, and it like that wouldn't really fit in my game at all because of the way I'm approaching the design of it. But like you can take that window and like make it bigger and step outside it, and it's like a
Right.
portal now, and you've arrived in this other
Oh.
like green grassy area. But it's like sort of surrealist or absurdist approach to meta design. You're trying to make sure the player is clear from the very beginning that like this is a world with crazy rules, and there can be really unexpected things that happen. And because you're like unsettling them from the beginning, it feels consistent when weird stuff like that happens.
Right.
Which is, I think it's a really smart design choice with your mechanic.
Yeah, it's yeah, I sort of have a similar problem. So I'm in some ways taking the completely different approach with instead of being, and I think surreal is a really good word to describe Albert's game, this like dream world. Whereas for me, my game is much more like maybe similar to yours, Steve, but that it has this one set of rules for the physics, and it's just different from the set of rules that we are familiar with, but that within the world it's like consistent across everywhere, and it's more about kind of discovering that and understanding that is sort of the process. So like everything is the same from the beginning to the end,
Yeah.
but it's just this like other thing that you start to dig through.
Your game out of the three of us feels the cleanest.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually just looking at that when you were, I'm going to jump into this because when you were carrying stuff too, I noticed. So that was very interesting that we all have very different ways of carrying objects that tie into that in a way it's almost like a microcosm of the rest of the game, because like Steve, you can carry objects and you can rotate them, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, a part of your mechanic is rotating. So if you allow people to rotate objects, that would screw up your whole mechanic.
Yeah. I think Unity might have crashed, which is something that happens pretty often. But
Yes.
when like objects don't actually, no, there we go. And I'll show you this way: is that objects they never carry their shape doesn't they don't have any rotation. Like even when you pick them up or move around, they always stay consistent. And everything does fall on a grid. Not while you're carrying them, but when you put them down, they snap to a 0.25 grid. Because it's like,
Oh, that's really cool. I didn't know about that.
yeah, and there's no physics in the sense that when you stack objects, they don't like they're not going to topple over. Which I think, Steve, it looks like I think both of yours games do that, right? That there is some physics, like things roll and fall over. Yeah. So I guess this is a really good example.
So that's what I mean when I say it's clean. It's like you have so much control over all the physics in your game, right? Like there's stuff doesn't roll around.
Yeah, and like so I can just put this box. It's like if you want to put it there, then it goes there, and that's it's like if you can solve it. If you get the idea that the execution is never an issue,
Right.
But I'm sort of able to do that because they're not realistic objects. It's basically stepping through these like 3D spatial puzzles, but all very logic based. If you place it here and then like here for example is I can use this purple block to stop this one fall, and if you place them in the right place, there's not going to be any problems there.
Which is smart for a puzzle game. Like I think both Albert and I have some funny problems that are resulting from being able to change the scale of objects as much as you want all the time.
Yeah, it's interesting because you guys have that's kind of this other thing where in a ways you guys have a tricky spot when it comes to scaling the mechanic. No pun intended, or pun very much intended. Right, where it's like you can scale an object to be incredibly massive and break the game, or too small and break the game. And my mechanic has sort of, I have other problems, but not that one. I was kind of curious how you guys approach that.
Haphazardly.
Yeah, like once I started building a lot of puzzles, I realized like having a certain amount of like non-physicsness or just very certain actions actually make the puzzle game more like make a lot more sense to people, right? Because that's that's how you teach people things is you give them a very consistent rule, and the more physics you add in, the more kind of playful the game becomes. And if you add too much physics, then it becomes more like reaction based or kind of an impromptu game that's more about playing, right? So like an example is the game Tiny and Big has a lot of physics related to it, but it's much less of a puzzle game and it's more of an action game, even though at first you might think, oh, these could be really interesting puzzle solving mechanics. And it's weird how like our games are on a different scale, no pun intended, in terms of like how much physics we're using in our games. Like my game has this problem because it's physics based. It's like if I want players to put a ramp somewhere, sometimes they'll just have problems lining the ramp up and making sure it's not too lopsided so it slides down again because physics. But in your game you don't have that problem.
Yeah. Although, like Portal does kind of do the halfway, like when you go on when you fly through portals, it almost feels like there's a pretty set path that you take every time. Yeah.
Wait, what are you talking about? When you go through, like the first one or the second one?
The second one. Like it feels like if you sort of like set them up in the right spot, flying through portals feels like and also the jumping. And I'm thinking more so the Portal 2 has the little platforms that make you jump, right? And the booster platforms, and those always felt like it was the exact same path every time you got on them.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic. Like I understand why they did that, but that was actually something that I didn't like in the second Portal. Like in my mind, when I was playing it, I was like, man, if you guys had to, like, if you made a goal where there's like a box and you have to like use a portal to launch the box, and you're like launching the box up into the corner, and it has to like land perfectly on this little ledge or whatever. If you have to like make it so that when I drop it through the portal, it like hits a zone very clearly and then like lerps onto the shelf because otherwise it's just too hard for people because it's too fiddly, then I kind of feel like it's too fiddly and you should have just taken it out, right? Like it's not even that interesting a thing. I feel like they were doing too much like too much editing after the fact, like forcing a puzzle to work when it actually probably should have just been cut. Whereas the light bridges that come through the portal is like a perfect example of a mechanic that works really well with the portals.
Right. Although I'm curious because I don't know if you still have it, Steve, but you had like these flowers that you can stand on to launch you, right? Or if you scale them up very quickly, you would kind of fly up.
Right.
But I don't know how much of it is like spoilery.
Oh no, whatever. I mean,
yeah. But yeah. So doesn't that become? That seems like it would have a similar issue with the portal boosters.
Well, here I'll share screens.
Yeah.
The flowers and actually any scalable object can be a launcher.
Right.
It just takes the normal that you're standing on and then looks at the direction of this, like the way that the scaling is happening, and then tries to just give you a velocity boost in that direction. So it actually isn't, like, it's pretty organic, which can cause some problems. Like, I understand why they did it the way that they did it. But yeah, I don't know. It seems like it works pretty well.
Yeah.
The biggest problem was, and this is okay. So this is something that I wrote a blog post about, and I was talking about on my stream a couple weeks ago. The biggest problem in the game is just being able to get on top of small objects consistently. Like Albert and I have this exact same problem, which is that because in our games we can scale objects up and down as much as we want, and you want to be able to like scale an object up and down and then run around on it and do different stuff. If you can scale objects up and down as much as you want, then as a designer trying to tune the game, you can't consistently predict how big things are going to be when people try to get on them, which is like a huge problem for tuning, right? Like one of the pillars of tuning a game is like knowing how big things are going to be in the world, and so it became this huge problem. And so I solved this problem a couple of weeks ago, and I feel really happy with the solution because I've done a fair amount of testing since then, and it seems really to be working really well. But the solution that I came up with was basically like, if you have let's see, there's a box in here. Yeah, you have a box, right? And let's say it's that big. If I get close to it, I just get like a little prompt on my screen that says like hop on, and I just hit the space bar and it just puts me on top of it. It's like a little context sensitive jump thing. And it works even if the thing is like really small. So now I'm like on top of this really small thing. And then if the thing is too big, it just like won't give me the prompt. And so it basically took away the biggest problem, because the problem people would have is they'd be staring at a small thing and they want to get on top of it to ride it up, and they would just like jump over it over and over again because I couldn't tune. There's no way to tune the jump for every possible size of an object or whatever. So that was actually the biggest problem with the flowers. And so having solved that problem, now the flowers become much more viable. Like just getting on top of the flowers was actually the biggest problem, and now the launching of them feels pretty good, I think.
So it's
like
basically having like these dynamic prompts only showing when, basically communicating to the player when they can get on it versus when they can't. Yeah,
and actually I don't think it needs the prompts because no one reads prompts like that anyway. Like people never read any text in games ever.
I never read any text,
yeah. If I just take it away, people just think that they jumped because you sort of do it, like, because you can still do a regular jump too, but if you just walk up to something, generally speaking, what people do is that, right, when they want to get up on something. And so it just like sort of seamlessly puts them right where they wanted to go, and most people didn't even realize it was not just a regular jump.
Oh, I see.
I feel really good about that as a solution. Like I think that works really well. And it works for like small, thin objects too and stuff like that.
Yeah, I feel
launch.
I feel it's a really good solution because it takes kind of like the trial and error aspect out of it and makes it more discrete, and that's really useful in puzzle games.
Right. I wonder if you guys have a issue with. So for me, my game is like, if it feels like you're doing it wrong, then it's probably the wrong approach. Because the execution never has. You're never gonna be like, I know how to solve it, but for some reason I just can't get the execution right. And I was wondering if you guys, how do you then, deal with, because you have real physics and sometimes things can be finicky, and you also, both of you guys have like dynamic sizes, right? When it comes to scaling, they're not discrete sizes, and people are like, okay, I think I gotta scale up this house, but it's like kind of close, but not quite. Is this? Am I not scaling it large enough, or? Yeah, I was just wondering if that was an issue in terms of puzzle design that you guys are looking at.
I think the simple answer is yes. That is. And then I mean, like, my game also has a third dimension of problems. Is that when people look at the elements in the room, sometimes they think because William, like your game looks aesthetically really clean, right? You can't accidentally, find an object that might be part of the puzzle.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So then, but my games, I change the rules around a bit, so people sometimes will think, oh, maybe I'm supposed to. Here's a door here. Maybe I'm supposed to match, the door, pick up the door, match it with the door frame, and when I take it off, there'll be a new exit. But that's like not. That's just a door,
Right.
And yeah, so in terms of kind of dealing with how the scale and the physics mess with the predictability of the puzzle, Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a big problem, haha, and a small problem, haha. The problem is that, yeah, because we're playing with the size of objects. One of the neat things about it is that anything can be repurposed. For example, like I have a level where there's just like shelving attached to the wall, and at one point you realize that you can get up and use the shelving to like get across to a new area if you consider the shelving a pathway as opposed to being just like shelves with random stuff on it. And the problem is to design things for the player so that they're not always getting the wrong signal, I guess. Like, you want them to get the transmission that, like, yeah, this is a thing that can now be different because you can change the size of things, but not everything is like that. And I don't know, it's interesting. Like, we're both dealing with that in different ways. It's like what we were talking about before, right? Like, you set up this absurdity, but yeah, I guess it can come to bite you too, right? I bet you've seen that in playtesting where if you set up a room, unintentional consequences happen in terms of people's perception of what can be picked up and dealt with and what's part of the puzzle and what's not. I know. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I don't think there's not really like a prescriptive way to answer it. It's basically just like, yeah, that's a big problem with this type of game or with this design.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to kind of go to yeah, anyway, that's they're just problems. I was just,
Yeah.
that's all I was thinking. Yeah. I know with in terms of metagames too, that for me actually a big influence has sort of been Starseed Pilgrim and especially the way that game sort of has the mechanics evolve has been a big influence for me. Yeah. Anyway, do you guys have? Sorry.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I feel like a lot of people don't actually haven't played Starseed Pilgrim. Because
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting.
Let's see here. There are two things. I am going to be spoiling a bit of Starseed Pilgrim then, I suppose.
So
But
spoiler warning.
spoiler warning if you don't want to um, have Starseed. But I actually and Draken always talks about how he like wants to keep stuff there a secret, and I totally respect that. But I feel like even knowing what the mechanics of the game are doesn't hurt the experience. But basically in Starseed Pilgrim, it's a game where you plant seeds, you jump around. You start off in this abyss, and you learn. And it doesn't really explain the rules. It tells you how to move around, but you plant seeds and you kind of expand out into the abyss. And what is very cool is that it's got, once you grow seeds and this darkness. This image I selected is from my own website. But this darkness is sort of growing all the time, and it's kind of catching up to you as you plant seeds. And at some point, the darkness catches up, and that session ends, and it flips the world to be this black and white negative. So what used to be land is now space, and what used to be space is now land. And I really like that idea of, and Richard Terrell, who wrote Starseed Observatory, which is this like giant website that analyzes Starseed Pilgrim, talks about that as folded level design, which is when you use the same level in a different way. And so like one example is if you have to sneak into, if you're doing just like a third-person adventure shooter or first-person shooter, you gotta sneak into a level, so it's like a stealth mechanic, stealth type of play, and then you collect this item, and then you set off the alarm, and then you gotta shoot your way out of the level, but using the same path. And so you're using the same level, but playing it in two different ways. I think actually the cleanest example is Ridiculous Fishing, where on the way down, are you trying to avoid all the fish? Yeah, you're trying to avoid all the fish, and then on the way up, you're going through the exact same area, different direction, and now you're trying to capture all the fish. I think that's like the cleanest example of folded level design I can find. And Starseed Pilgrim is another example, but it has this it just has a really interesting game loop that on its own that I've never seen anywhere else done before. Starseed Pilgrim, I mean, and that's where I got this idea, and I kind of like it because it, with the name of the game Manifold, that having, the game is about learning to look at architecture and your space from different perspectives, and I feel like, when you change gravity, that's a very explicit way of, hey, your perspective's shifted, but I think having you go through the level in a different way with different set of mechanics is another way of changing your relationship to the space. So Starseed's got that this core loop, this inversion of space, and then the way it kind of keeps. What I really like about Starseed Pilgrim 2 is that the way you travel to different areas is a microcosm of the mechanics. And I've sort of taken that into the way Manifold Garden unfolds. Yeah, and I've shifted away from puzzle design, puzzles as the main focus. I think I don't know if you guys got similar. If your experience is similar, but for me, when I applied to, I originally had a lot of these box puzzles, and some of them, I call them exam puzzles. So you like learn concept A, you learn concept B, you learn concept C, and then there'd just be one where nothing new is introduced, but you got to learn to use concept A, B, and C together. And I think a lot of when I applied to festivals, a lot of the feedback I got was like, those ones are very tedious. And I've taken out a lot of that, and I'm focusing more on level design and architecture spaces. Like initially, it's about puzzles just so players understand the mechanics. Like the puzzle is a way of highlighting rules, and then, but later on, it's not so much about the puzzles that it is about exploring space.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually one of the topics I want to talk about is kind of this weird relationship between, the puzzles and kind of the rest of the game or like the entire experience as a whole. Because sometimes puzzles will sometimes not, well, sometimes they'll fit in the game, sometimes they won't fit in that game, quite as well. And I think when you're making a puzzle game, there's like this kind of a dilemma on whether I should make a set of puzzles that are very solid and very very logical and good, or should I try to like wrap that more into the world or the narrative or the art, for example.
Yeah.
And
sorry.
relating to that is actually the interesting fact that all our three games have very different art styles.
Yeah.
It's almost if you put them together, you could like use that to explain to people, the different genres of art style. There's like very abstract, and then there's more low poly stuff, and then there's more realistic type of styles. And I think that's all reflected throughout kind of different game design choices that we made.
Right.
There's an interesting topic there, which is more about just like puzzle game design generally, but I think we're each approaching it, solving it in a different, interesting way. But the topic is the idea of tedium and teaching versus like novelty and interestingness. But like, you got to teach people the concepts. You got to lead them along. You have to start them at some base level and give them a ramp. Otherwise, they'll not be interested in the game because they'll just be lost in a sea of confusion. But you also need to do that without making it really boring. So I've actually been doing something similar too, where I've been like mushing together multiple like starting goals and kind of like trying to make sure that as soon as you're taught a concept, you're shown something novel and interesting that uses it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually curious on what William thinks on kind of how Starseed Pilgrim handles that, because there's not really a tutorial to Starseed Pilgrim.
It's very obtuse.
I actually think the opening of Starseed Pilgrim isn't great, although I don't. It's hard. I think it's one of those things where I feel like it has to be that way. Like, if he had, which is a shame. It's like if he had taught it, it wouldn't be as interesting. But because of that, it makes it very inaccessible, right? But because and the reason why I say it has to be that way is because when you start off in the island, there's, the game. It's just sort of you and the abyss, and I think it's like you just have to want to explore. So I think the idea of Starseed is like reaching out into nothingness, and so any explanation I feel would kind of detract from that. But to go to about the tedium stuff, and I feel like that ties into puzzle design philosophy, and I'm assuming Jonathan Blow's work is sort of a big influence for all of us, but I feel like, and I don't, I'm not trying to like summarize his approach, but to me it seems like John's very interested in exploring all facets of the mechanic. And I think The Witness certainly does that, and I'm not shifting more away from that approach. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, you say you were shifting or not shifting towards that
Shifting
approach?
away from that. Like, I feel
shifting away, okay.
John's approach is you have this mechanic, and then we're going to explore like every facet of it.
Every possible,
Yeah, and it's this idea that the mechanic reveals the truth about the universe in the game. But then that leads to a lot of stuff that's just super tedious and not quite as interesting or fun.
Right.
Like the sort of adhering to that seems to override some other game design concerns. And I was wondering if you guys are similar, wanting to approach it in a similar way or not. We're like, and I'm saying I've moved away from that where I know there are some puzzles that it's like, okay, well, if we were exploring these concepts, then it would make sense to explore these other ones. But I'm just like, these are just not fun, so I'm just not doing them. Or even certain existing concepts, I don't explore them fully. Yeah.
I mean, I think that I want to always be open to like putting something in completeness, even if it's like not the most fun thing ever. If it's like necessary to show you something that's really interesting, that I think is really interesting, that's really illuminating. But I do think that like you could very easily make the argument, about The Witness, that there was some stuff that could have been cut from there, and to me that was at odds with some of his previously stated desire in design to always like have the bare minimum of what's necessary and cut everything else, right? Like no filler. So I felt like The Witness actually had some filler. And so it's an interesting question. It's like, okay, so was that intentional? I have to think that it was at some level, but like, how do you kind of reconcile that? I don't really know the answer to that. So yeah, I don't know. I guess with my game, I'm basically just like trying to cut everything that's not interesting, unless I think there's something that really needs to be there. Even if it's like something that people struggle with a bit, it's like it's almost like at that point it's just a challenge to figure out where it fits so that it makes sense to people.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not afraid to leave stuff in that I don't think is like the most fun thing. Like that's not really my criteria. It's just like, does it feel like it belongs in the game or not? And it's sort of it's sort of an abstract concept, but yeah.
Yeah.
I think I don't know. What do you guys think about? Do you think The Witness had filler puzzles? And what do you think about that?
Personally,
not filler in the sense that they were placed there intended to waste your time the way that you would think of filler from like a AAA game. Probably not so much anymore, but like of the era in which we were trying to rebel against that kind of thing and like do something that was more pure. But like filler in terms of like didn't actually necessarily need to be there because it doesn't add that much to the game, I guess.
Yeah, I felt, well, in some of them I just felt they were, it placed purity of design over engaging for me for some of them. Maybe that's like, I can see some of those, like in that some of those puzzles they explored another aspect of the idea, but they just weren't as interesting as the other ones, and he included them as well.
Okay.
I feel part of it is based kind of on personal preference almost, because I know I'm more like a crazy, one-off kind of guy, but there's some people who really enjoy, for example, the later puzzles of Antichamber as opposed to, the first half. Like they really like kind of the meatiness and logicness of it, even though to some others it might not be engaging, right? So like that's still something I'm trying to figure out, but well, at least what I'm trying to do is just like build the game that would interest me the most, and hopefully see where it goes.
Before
sorry, you want to? Oh, sorry.
You go continue, Steve. Yeah.
Okay, I was just going to ask Albert. So were those later puzzles in Antichamber your favorites?
No, I like the first half of it.
Yeah, me too.
But I know some people who like the second half, which, so I guess it's just difference of taste, maybe.
Right. Garlando Bloom talked about wanted to ask about story in terms of how that fits in with our games, because it seems like Steve is the only one with a very explicit story. You got a character, she's got a name, she's got a, you know, a history, and like this is why you're here. And I think for me, mine's much more of a parable. It's allegorical, with and I yeah. For me, I've sort of chosen that just because I felt like I'm not a good writer. I tried to originally have the story, and you were like an architect in a coma or something, or you're it was very Christopher Nolan. Like, so all of Nolan's films, there's like a dead wife or dead ex-wife or something, which I really don't like. Like, I noticed that at some point, and I was like, and it had that, and you were like supposed to go in and your significant other is in a coma, and you go inside, and which is like explain that. But it felt like one, I'm not a very good writer, and every attempt at trying to shove something in just kind of took away from the abstractness of it, and it also like it made it less interesting. Every kind of reality I try to ground it into, and then it also meant I was like, well, does this make sense? Like, why would she have these boxes and these switches in her head? Like,
Right. Yeah.
like, why did she design all these puzzles, and why are they perfectly designed to have this difficulty curve that I can solve? So I just went away with it. I just did away with it. So you guys could talk about that.
I feel like I kind of went through a similar process of what you did, but I'm still trying to figure it out. And like you mentioned, this is like once you have kind of puzzles in a very organized structure to your game, then you start asking questions like, why would this actually exist in real life? And there's almost like two choices you have to do. Is one, you have to kind of, if you're doing a story, is to write the idea of puzzles into the game, like, oh, there are actually somebody who made these puzzles, and puzzles, are here to test something. Or the other way is to kind of ignore it and say like, oh, I know your actual goal is to do X, and we know that, but you still need to go grab this like shiny orb somewhere, just because, and then you kind of go along with the game because it's the game, right? So
Right.
yeah, so that's actually I'm still struggling with, and like funny enough, because all three of our games are kind of based on the surreal part. Like we've all kind of went to, I think, like the dream space at some point.
Yeah, we all went to the dream world.
Yeah, the dream world, because that's the easiest way to explain. Like, oh, why do these crazy puzzles that don't exist in the real world exist? Oh, because it's the dream world. So of course, So
Yeah, but the problem with dream worlds is that like they're just so unsatisfying unless you have a really good idea for and do a really good job of setting up a fiction where that makes sense. Like the Matrix, right? They very explicitly, if you die in the Matrix, you die in the real world, right?
Yeah.
And then Inception, it's like you will be trapped forever in this like infinite layer of Inception if you don't, whatever.
Like
right?
rules
They
and
set up
consequences.
yeah, and you need, I feel you need to ground the world very well, because like even if you use Inception as kind of a reference material, like Inception doesn't really stick to one setting or one type of setting. It kind of like bounces around, and like as a reference to kind of base your work on, that's not the best. And a lot of dream references, or like Alice in Wonderland, there's crazy ideas coming in and out instead of being one about very specifically one thing. Yeah.
I guess maybe
Go on.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe the question that Matthew is asking is like, at some level, what business do we have writing a story like when clearly
True, yeah.
all the energy
Right.
is going primarily into making a puzzle game, and like to more or less degree it's like fun and interesting or whatever. But I guess for me it comes back to it's something that not Eric Wolpaw, but like the main producer at Valve said about Portal, which is that they had come up with this idea, right? They got these kids who made Narbacular Drop, and they took this Narbacular Drop game and they made this long game out of it, and it wasn't really like in the Half-Life world or anything. It didn't really have a fiction. They just thought it was cool, and they're like, yeah, here, use our engine and just make a cool thing. And just sort of by default, they started using all the assets, and they started by making like these big elaborate worlds, and then they like came to all these realizations about how to actually make like a puzzle game that works for this type of experimental mechanic, and they started cleaning it up. And this is all in like the developer commentary if you watch whatever. But they went through all this whole process of like making the puzzles, and they like just started shrinking the rooms down and taking everything out except for just the puzzle elements until they got to this sort of beautiful point where they have these puzzles, and they're like weird and experimental and cool and unique, and you can like play with them, and it's fun just to screw around and do portals even if you haven't figured out the puzzle yet. And then they got to this certain point where they just stalled out because they had this game where they knew all the puzzles were really cool, and they put them in order, and everybody just got bored at around the same point. It was about 45 minutes to an hour in. And that's when Eric Wolpaw came on and wrote a story for the game and came up with this fiction of like GLaDOS and you're being tested. And at the 45-minute mark, about the hour mark, depending on how fast you play, is right when you break out of the first structure of the test chamber and you really start to push back against GLaDOS and get out into the wall.
Yeah,
what he said was,
sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say. And what he said was, people came for the puzzles and the experimental mechanic, but they stayed for GLaDOS, and it was like a big realization for them that just to have a narrative context, a reason that you're doing things, something to push against, even if it was so simple, was like the key to actually making this a sustainable 4-hour game as opposed to making it like a tech demo or a half-hour demo or an hour-long demo, right? Like there needed to be something more. And so knowing that and looking at what I have and knowing like what it looks like when people play it for X number of hours, I really want to have a story to bind things together, to give people a reason to keep doing what they're doing, and so on.
Right. Yeah, I think there it's like the story has a functional purpose, right? Which is to tackle the problem of puzzle fatigue, and I noticed that early on too when I had just like puzzle 1, puzzle 2, puzzle 3. It was like by puzzle 6 everyone started yawning. This was like in an earlier version, and so in some ways like the reason why I don't have a story is because I decided to address puzzle fatigue by doing exploration. Like I thought, exploring new spaces, opening that up, kind of the architecture, which is more like what I'm much more comfortable doing that would offset the puzzle fatigue. So that's like, if you can look at, it's like puzzle, like the story serving a function, and instead of using a story, I'm using architecture and exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
So yeah, I mean, I guess so. Then to kind of try to get more specific, personally, part of my inspiration for scale is derived from things like Einstein's dreams, and I'm just like a physics fanboy. Which is a funny thing to say about yourself, but it's like I'm really into the history of physics, and I've like read a lot about it, and it's really interesting to me. And so I made the character sort of popped out to me as a physicist, and I really like this idea that she's not like a physicist the way that Gordon Freeman is a physicist. Right. She's a physicist in that she tries to uncover deeper truths about the world, and this invention of this scaling device, what motivated it, and I have this is like part of the backstory that will be conveyed through the game in question mark way, I don't really know, but part of the reason, the motivation for the scale gun is like there's this problem in physics where since like the 16th century or something, people have been inventing instruments that are supposed to detect certain truths about nature, but there's no way to verify whether or not that thing is true in another, like in an objective way with your own senses. So you have to design the instrument, you have to design the experiment, what it's supposed to test, and then you also have to be the one who explains why this is showing this or it's not showing it, right? So the classic example is like Copernicus or something could take a a telescope, point it at the moon, and say there's craters on the moon, or whatever. Like, and then he could take the telescope and then just aim it back down at the horizon line and aim it at a book in a tower a mile away, and walk over to that tower and say, yes, indeed, that book is there, like that, right? Like that is what I saw. Therefore, I have verified with my own eyes that this instrument is correct. But you can't do that with like a interferometer or something like that, or with a Large Hadron Collider. Like, there's no,
Yeah.
we have to trust that the people are inventing are
Right.
reading the data correct. So the idea is that she comes up with this device that would allow us to scale the tiniest constituent parts of matter up to the point where they can be seen with the naked eye, and that's like the motivating reason behind her inventing this device.
Oh.
And so there's like a whole,
Sorry.
and that's just like a fiction that occurs in my brain as like
Right.
a reason why this thing would exist, and it's just something that's interesting to me.
Did you know that I had studied physics and worked in a linear accelerator lab?
I did not know that. That's awesome.
I should be the main character of Scale.
Yeah, you should. I'm gonna give her some white glasses.
Forget Penny.
Yeah.
I will give you all the voice acting.
That sounds good. Or you can give me physics advice. That'd be perfect. I didn't know that.
So we
Like-
are at 4:20 now, which I think would be a good time to wrap up this stream. Oh, not because 4:20.
Because I gotta go.
Actually, I have something very important I do. But I don't know if there's like any last minute things final things that we want to discuss, or if people in the chat have questions. I will, Steve. I will give you what the fuck, like just 100 variations of it.
Is that when Unity crashes?
That's basically. Well, actually, not even. Just when something goes not the way I expected it to, which is all the time. If there's any final topics we wanna discuss, and of course you can reach out to all of us on Twitter. The handles are just below, and Steve also streams regularly at twitch.tv/Steve Swink.
Yeah, follow me.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess one last thing I kind of wanted to say is, while I was making this game, I realized that the way you make kind of creative decisions is very interesting, because sometimes it's not the most logical thing, because usually when you want to do a puzzle game, you want to make sure everything's logical. But after a while, you realize that sometimes, you just want to throw things in that are interesting, and those are actually the most interesting things to other people, right? It's like, and all your decisions are kind of based off of like previous things that you've seen or previous things that you thought were interesting, not necessarily like the most logical things that fit at the moment. And sometimes those kind of, like for example, like for William, like architecture, right? That's something that's you like, and that's something you end up putting in the game, and that's people really relate to that, even though there's no kind of super logical reason why you put it in, but after you put it in, it turns into like an integral part of the game. And
like there's it's not sort of, in some ways you almost have to go outside of puzzle and rules to kind of inject something more. Definitely.
Heart.
Right, yeah.
The game has to have heart.
Yeah.
A really interesting case for me is, did you guys get very far into Cube? Qube?
Yeah.
No?
I think, I don't know if I beat it, but I got very far. Yeah, that was a while ago. That was actually one of the first games I played when I was studying. I played Portal, and then I was like, oh, what other similar games? And Qube was one of the first ones
Yeah.
I played.
It's interesting because you can actually see a before and after. Like, they did a before, which was purely clinically puzzles arranged in order with very little treatment, with like white rooms and colored blocks. And then there's like the story version, and the story's not great, but it's really fascinating to compare the two.
Oh, I think I must have played the non-story version. That one, like the first one was released, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Then they did like a remix version
that's
where they
right,
added
that's
a whole
right.
story about aliens and stuff. You're like escaping an alien spaceship.
Oh, I should check that
wow.
out.
But it's like the same game.
Right, but that would be interesting to see where the how story kind of factors in, and like definitely something to study.
Yeah, it's different. Like, I think it's better. Like, it's really fascinating.
All right. Well, I think this would be a good place to end the stream then. It seems like there aren't any more questions from the chat. We can do this another time, I think. Certainly
Sure.
there's
That's
a
fun.
lot of stuff to talk about. I think we've only lightly brushed the surface today. So yeah, there. Now before we end, let me move the camera down so kind of talk about everybody's game. So Steve, your game
Okay.
is Scale the game. Scale game.
Scale-game.com.
Scale-game and Museum of Simulation Technology. That's is it just Pillow Castle Games, Albert?
Yep.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
okay.
Are we talking about websites now?
Yeah. Just kind of let people
Okay, I
know
can post
where they
it,
can
or-
find
yeah.
more information.
At pillowcastlegames.com.
Yeah, and then everybody, thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed the stream, definitely follow this channel and also Steve's channel, Steve Swink, and we're all on Twitter. And final thing, I know, does anybody here have a date for when the game's out, or we're all more or less when it's done?
Yeah, when it's done, but
Okay.
sooner rather than later, because I'm about ready to be done with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm the farthest out. I'm at least like a year and a half.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you both for joining us, for joining me, and yeah, we will stay in touch.
Thanks, Willie.
Thanks, Will.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye.
We'll see you at the Impossible Club sometime.
Yes.
Everybody.